What's happening, everyone? Blessings to you. On our deal it.
Recognize royalty. Recognize it. Recognize royalty. Gotta recognize it. Recognize royalty. Like they ain't got eyes to recognize royalty.
I can feel.
Recognize royalty.
I can see.
Recognize royalty.
Now I recognize
Royalty.
royalty's eyes.
Royalty.
I can see.
Recognize royalty.
I can love again.
Recognize royalty.
Now I
I recognize it.
royalty.
I recognize passion. Never just a man with the title in his hand, with the vital in his hand, with the Bible in his hand. Never just a man with the scepter in demand, with the lecture in the stand, with the vector and the candle. Can you understand the grand from the texture of the hand? Hard at work, are you hard at work, working with the man? Don't kiss the ring of royalty. Crown him king, just a thing, letting loyalty ring. Bring frankincense and myrrh and other things. It's gold already blings from the highest that prizes no sins. Recognize your kings, overruling commandments with the Trinity and the power it brings. When you recognize royalty, I feel it.
I can see.
Yeah, I see it. I recognize now.
Royalty's eyes.
Royalty,
I can see.
I see it.
I can love again.
Now I'm in love now.
Now
I recognize your passion.
royalty.
Recognize royalty.
Yeah, peace. So, I wanted to speak a little bit about the abolitionist movement, just really briefly. The reason that I wanted to speak on it was from a previous video I did where we spoke about just the Caribbean, the debt that FBA owes the Caribbean immigrant, and we were talking about how the abolition movement was really motivated, inspired, influenced by the by what was going on in the Caribbean with the slave revolts, with the abolition movement in the Caribbean. And I think it's what was going on in the Caribbean that kind of got them hip to how really brutal slavery was. And I think it's the fact that most slaves were sent to the Caribbean. Most of the slaves from the transatlantic slave trade were sent to the Caribbean. And it was based on what was happening in the Caribbean that abolitionists in Europe and in the Americas kind of realized how brutal slavery was. And it's what kind of lit the spark for the abolition movement in those parts of the world. So we were just saying that, Europe and the Americas, in terms of the slaves in those parts of the world, owes a great debt to the Caribbean, because the Caribbean is where the abolition movement started, and the abolition movement was really centered around what was going on in the Caribbean. And so from doing that small research, I just ran into what was known as the Anti-Slavery Society Convention of 1840. And I just wanted to share a little bit of what I learned about that. It says the painting is what is in my thumbnail. So you can see the painting that's in front of you actually on this video. It says the painting shows the World Anti-Slavery Society Convention in 1840. The Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1838 after laws were passed in Britain to ban the trade and the ownership of enslaved people. Its members wanted to end slavery around the world. Campaigner Thomas Clarkson is giving a speech to an international audience. Several other people who had campaigned for abolition in Britain are in the portrait, but many more had died long before it was painted. The painting is enormous, close to 4 meters wide and 3 meters tall, almost as tall as a double-decker bus. And the interesting part is where it goes into prejudices behind the portrait. And I'm reading from the the global, I'm sorry, the National Portrait Gallery. It's npg.org.uk. It's the National Portrait Gallery, the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Portraits of Abolition, and it's the section on the Anti-Slavery Society Convention. So now the prejudices behind the portrait. It says there are problems and prejudices behind the Anti-Slavery Society Convention in 1840. Look again at the picture. In 1840, many of the male abolitionists did not want women to be allowed into the convention. Eventually, they decided women could come and listen as spectators, but not speak in discussions. This is why the artist positioned women at the edges of the painting. Some abolitionists complained about the artist's choice to place Henry Beckford front and center in the portrait because he was a formerly enslaved Black Jamaican. What does this tell us about attitudes in Britain in the 1800s? These attitudes were not unusual in the 1800s. The event in this painting celebrated the achievements of the abolition movement from the 1780s up to 1840. These stories about the painting reveal that many people at the time, even about abolitionists, wanted the history of abolition to be told with a focus on white men. This is not the whole story. So what I wanted to draw attention to was the fact that front and center of this portrait, front and center of the portrait of the Anti-Slavery Society Convention is a Black Jamaican, a former slave. So, which kind of, I think, points to the idea that Caribbeans and even Jamaicans in particular are at the heart of the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery movement. There is a great debt owed to the Caribbean, and it only makes sense because, like I said, most slaves were sent to the Caribbean. So it's only right that most of the revolts and the uprisings would happen in the Caribbean because that's where most of them were. So it's not necessarily for any other reason than that. But, regardless of that, Jamaicans are front and center. Here we go with another Jamaican front and center. So we had Jamaicans front and center of the Black Power movement, Jamaicans front and center of Pan-Africanism, Jamaicans front and center in hip hop, and a Jamaican front and center in the abolition movement. It just is what it is. So the whole point is that we're not just tethers. We're not just here leeching. You know what I'm saying? We've been involved at the most important positions of involvement. We have been involved at all levels in anti-slavery movements, abolition movements. Caribbean people, Jamaican people have been involved in all movements to support Black people throughout the ages, from the beginning. So I just wanted to point that out. His name again was Henry Beckford. So let's remember that name. I tried to see if there was anything I could find about him. I was only able to find one other little article about him that I'd like to share. Yeah, so I found an article in JamaicансAbroad.weebly.com on Henry Beckford that I'd just like to share. It says, and it shows the portrait of the at the anti-slavery convention with him front and center. And it says, of Henry Beckford, it says, a liberated slave, now a delegate, is looking up to Clarkson with deep interest, and the hand of a friend is resting with affection on his arm, in fellowship and protection. This is the point of interest in the picture and illustrative of the object in painting it. The African sitting by the intellectual European in equality and intelligence, whilst the patriarch of the cause points to heaven as to whom he must be grateful. So if you look closely at the picture, at the portrait, what you'll notice is that there is the one lone black face in that picture, right? Is he's not just a liberated slave. He's a delegate at that convention, right? He's a delegate at the convention, and he's the only black person there, and he's a Jamaican black man, right? It's not FBA. It's a Jamaican black man. The only black person you see in that portrait. You probably find another one or two, but you see him there, a Jamaican, with what FBA today would refer to as a tether, front and center, right? As a delegate to the anti-slavery convention. Very little appears to be known of Henry Beckford. We see the back of his head in the foreground of a painting of the great anti-slavery convention in London in June 1840. And we hear his voice earlier in Exeter Hall on May 22nd, 1840, when he speaks briefly at the reception for the Reverend William Knibb, himself and another ex-slave, Edward Barrett. Beyond that, we can pick up a few scraps from his words on that occasion. So we did say that, Caribbeans who had been liberated were traveling to Europe, traveling to the Americas, and, writing in their newspapers, joining their conventions, joining their abolition movements, and helping to bring attention to the brutality of slavery and why it needed to end. And this is just kind of reinforcing that. According to Hayden, Beckford had been a slave for 27 years, presumably from his birth. Beckford said that his mother had been sold in Africa by her brother, but with no indication of her age when she was sold. Wow. His mother was sold by her brother. And that's something. At the time of his visit to England, he was involved in teaching 110 children, presumably in a Baptist school, since he was described as a deacon of the St. Anne's Bay Baptist Church. Beyond this, I have found nothing. I hope that someone someday may come up with more. However, I do wonder if possibly I've encountered the son and granddaughter, and they go on to speak a little bit about just people trying to find information on this Henry Beckford. But it just echoes the point that very, very little is out there about him. But just the fact that he is front and center of that portrait speaks volumes about him, and speaks volumes about the abolition movement and the role of freed Caribbean slaves in that abolition movement. Again, the debt that is owed to Caribbean immigrants by people in the Americas, by slaves in the Americas and slaves in Europe is innumerable. And that stuff just should not be forgotten or underestimated or undervalued when we speak about the grand scheme of just who we are as a people, what we mean to each other, who we are to each other, and things of that nature. So I just wanted to put that out there. We are shaping everything about the history of the world. Caribbean people, we are not just leeching peoples. We are shaping the world. We are We are doing what we have to do to to support other people, and we are giving back as much as we're getting, if not giving back more. So again, let's just try to remember that. All right, y'all, that's it for now. Catch y'all on the next one. Peace.
Recognize royalty, recognize it, recognize royalty, gotta recognize it, recognize royalty, like they ain't got eyes to recognize royalty.
I can feel,
Recognize royalty,
I can see.
recognize royalty,
Now I recognize
royalty,
royalty's eyes.
royalty,
I can see,
recognize royalty,
I can love
recognize
again.
royalty,
Now I
recognize it.
royalty,
I recognize the passion. Never just a man with the title in his hand, with the vital in his hand, with the Bible in his hand. You never just a man with the scepter and demand, with the lecture and the stand, with the vector and the candle. Can you understand the grand from the texture of the hand? Hard at work, are you hard at work? Working with the man, don't kiss the ring of royalty. Crown him king, just a thing, letting loyalty ring. Bring frankincense and myrrh and other things. As gold already blings from the highest that prizes no sins. Recognize the king's overruling commandments with the Trinity and the power it brings. When you recognize royalty, I feel it.
I can see,
Yeah, I see it.
now
I recognize now.
royalty's eyes.
Royalty,
I can see,
I see it.
I can love again.
Now I'm in love now.
Now
I recognize your passion.
royalty.
Recognize royalty, sunrise royally. Sitting on top of the world, I'm five morally. Status of a king for surely. Morally, we pop dumb things till we stop the impurity. We pop them just for recognition. Listen to the missionary on a mission with the visionary vision. Do you recognize intuition? I reel in men when I went out fishing. I'll tell you why they rocked the boat. Cause they didn't understand what the prophet wrote. What's the conniption? The Jews crucifixion and refuse recognition at son child's christening in the mix some and some. Insist they fix the system from malarkey back to my monarchy. Yeah, back above me. Don't soil my purple and blue, and I will recognize your royalty too.
I can feel you.
I feel it.
I can see you.
I can see it.
Now
I recognize now.
royalty's eyes.
Your royalty.
I can see you.
I see it.
I can love again.
And I'm in love now.
Now I recognize
I recognize your passion.
royalty.
Royalty.